So let's start with the timeline. I'm going to try to rip through it. We'll go. Let's go, Ben. Let's go. I'm ready. Because this is a long story that we had to cut down. So let's take you back to March 12th of this year. Everything's this year. 7:27 a.m., Gretchen Whitmer flies on a private jet to West Palm Beach, Florida, to visit her father. She is not vaccinated at this time. The public is not informed about this flight plan. No one knows that she's there or that she left. March 15th. 3 days later, flight returns at 4:37 p.m. She leaves Florida, comes back home to Michigan. Let's move on. Now we're at April 5th. The Michigan Department of Health and Human Services issues an advisory urging residents not to travel. That's Gretchen Whitmer's leadership in that department. That's her department saying, don't travel. At that exact time, when that is released, the department director, Elizabeth Hurdle, was vacationing on the Gulf Coast in Alabama at the same day. Gretchen Whitmer's chief operating officer, Tricia Foster, had just recently returned from her own vacation in Florida. Major issues there. There's 3 and 1 bullet point issues on that one. So that's that one. Let's move to April 6th. This is 1 day later. Piggybacking on the prior one, Governor Whitmer backs her agency, backs her department that's under her leadership. Governor Whitmer publicly urges citizens not to travel and singles out Florida spring break trips specifically as particularly problematic in the wake of ongoing COVID concerns. Fast forward to April 19th, and here's where it gets really fun. The story breaks. MERSnews.com breaks the story that Governor Whitmer had traveled to Florida a month ago to visit her father. Details murky at best, and we're going to see him come out bit by bit. But now it's over a month later since that flight took place. Story's out, and here comes the avalanche. Still on April 19th, shortly after, the Whitmer office responds. Whitmer Press Secretary Bobby Leddy addresses the reports in the media. He states that the trip to Florida was 2 days long. Remember, it was actually 3. And that the governor made the trip to Florida when Michigan's daily positivity rates were in the low single digits. Luckily, this is verifiable. In fact, Michigan's rates hadn't been that low and hadn't been that low since February. They were actually above 10% at that time. Good for dead last in the country. So their risk mitigation right out of the gate, just blatant falsehoods. When Whitmer's office was asked for the dates the governor had traveled to Florida, who was on the plane, who paid for it, they refused to disclose any details, citing security concerns that somehow, in a world that 5-6 weeks after the fact, that makes sense. It makes none. What security concern is presented by sharing details of a flight I took 6 weeks ago? What are they going to do? Hop in the DeLorean and blow the plane up? Makes no sense. Someone can explain it to me how that makes any sense, but I haven't heard any reasonable explanation yet. Let's keep moving. So this is May 8th. Gretchen Whitmer refuses questions as to how the flight was paid for. Refuses. And repeated that the trip was, quote, 2 full days or less. Again, it was 3. It was not 2 full days or less. It was 3. It was over 72 hours long. We can all do math. Over 72 hours long is technically over 3 days long. So this has been said by her press secretary, and this has been said by her. Blatant falsehood, and they would know their itinerary, especially with 2 weeks to figure out what they're going to respond and how they're going to respond to this. Let's move on. May 14th, scrutiny's growing. So it's amid growing scrutiny, Whitmer's office finally reveals a nonprofit corporation paid most of that $27,000 plus cost of her flight to Florida. And now we get the 5th cook in this kitchen. Whitmer Chief of Staff Joanne Holes cites the, quote, extraordinary and ongoing threats to the life and safety of the governor when explaining the prior lack of transparency, not making it clear how transparency regarding a flight that occurred a month earlier would present any danger to anybody. And I'll ask this, if sharing the details of this flight a month later was so dangerous that they had to hide it then, how is it safe to share it now? If you're endangering her, you should go down with that ship. Look, I'm not going to endanger the governor. It's too dangerous. If there's a legitimate security concern, you wouldn't give up the pooch just to appease the media. If you think Gretchen Whitmer might die, as a result. So, I mean, it's nonsense. And any fair-minded person knows it's nonsense. So this she goes on, Joanne Holes. This is unbelievable. She repeats that the governor flew when Michigan had some of the lowest COVID rates in the country. Again, Michigan was dead last in the country at that time. She states that the trip was done in full compliance with all laws and COVID regulations. Let's get to May 17th, because it didn't take that long to fall, very long to fall apart. So we're just 3 days later. The Department of Health and Human Services states that the governor's trip did in fact not follow their guidelines. That's her department, by the way. That's not some right-wing hit job. Her own department said that the governor ignored the guideline to self-quarantine for 7 days upon returning home from travel. She gets back. No one knew about this trip. 3 days later, not 7. 3 days later, she's in public encouraging vaccination on March 18th, well short of that 7-day quarantine period. She's at Ford Field amongst other citizens. It wasn't the recommendation is 7 days and it was 6.5. It wasn't even, she more than cut it in half, the guideline. This is something that she did, by the way, this was revealed after she had just said, or her staff had just said, that she was fully compliant with all the guidelines. That's another inconsistency and another, at best, falsehood. I mean, if you don't want to be a cynic and call it a lie, whatever. But I mean, it's something they said that's demonstrably wrong. 3 days ain't 7. And they've admitted the timeline now, begrudgingly. Anyway, moving on, May 18th. This keeps getting better. Now the FAA is involved in this. The Federal Aviation whatever announces the investigation into Whitmer flight. They're coming out and they're saying that now they're investigating her, or investigating the company, really, based on this unlicensed charter flight. That the plane was not authorized or licensed to fly a charter flight, which they had done. So, right there, it's another issue. It's the drip, drip, drip drain here. Let's move on, May 27th. And I promise, I'm wrapping up my part, and then I'm going to get to the guy that knows a lot more about this stuff. May 27th, Governor Whitmer re-election campaign reveals that her daughters had been on the return flight from Florida. A previously undisclosed detail. Remember this story came out like over a month ago. Now it's coming out that the daughters were on there. This is inconsistent again with her original account that no gifts were accepted on the basis that she had paid for her single ticket. Again, she was accused of impropriety, potentially, accused of accepting a gift, maybe. And her response was, no. I paid $800 and some for my ticket. I'm good. If that's your defense, you can't then have it come out that your daughters were also on the plane, that at personal use of the plane. You didn't pay for them. You didn't say they were on the plane. You said because you paid for your single ticket. That was her words, not mine. I didn't say that. So it makes no sense. Another inconsistency. There's been no prior mention of the daughters being on this plane. No mention of Whitmer reimbursing the nonprofit corporation for their plane tickets. So where was that? I mean, Whitmer's campaign stated that it's going to foot the bill for the whole flight now. And Whitmer will now also reimburse the tickets for her daughter as well. Which is, if it was the right thing to do now, why wasn't it the right thing to do any time in the weeks prior? Again, doesn't make any sense. So let's bring it back to Jonathan L. Bernstein. I mean, you could tell me, because, look, let's get it out of the way right now. I voted for Gretchen Whitmer. Voted for Joe Biden. You're not talking to Alex Jones right now. If I'm in your living room, in your car, wherever you're watching or listening, you're not talking to some right-wing hack. This is just objective fact, and none of these things are in dispute as far as I know. Maybe Chad will chime in shortly. But let's just revisit Jonathan L. Bernstein, right? How did Gretchen Whitmer do on the 3-point scale here, on the 3 bullet point? Talk first, talk early. You tell me how that went. How do you think talk first, talk early went? The governor didn't tell anybody about this trip, and when it was reported by a news agency, she refused comment. So we don't have to get into all that now, but that's 0 for 1. Point number 2, concentrate your communication. Have a single centralized source of information. Hell, we heard from at least 5. The governor herself, the governor's reelection campaign representative, the governor's reelection campaign attorney, the governor's chief of staff. the governor's press secretary, the Michigan State Police Department chimed in on this when they couldn't get answers from the governor. Everybody but the Whitmer family pet has chimed in on her side at this point. I don't know who else there is to ask. So concentrate your communication. I mean, if it's supposed to be one source, maybe I'll give you two. You don't get 6, 7, or 8 people telling me different versions of the story. It's preposterous. So that's over 2. And finally, make it easy for the media. Point number 3, the governor has no commented the story to death. And even when the facts were revealed, it was begrudgingly after bad press had revealed half, 3/4, or 100%. So the few times that things actually have come out, it's when she's over a barrel. It wasn't in the spirit of transparency. So, I mean, in summary, this has been a complete failure of communications and PR management. This team is 0 for 3 on the core principles of managing a crisis, according to the foremost expert in the field. And what really shocks me is they have had months, not days, not weeks, months to say, okay, we're going to pivot toward transparency. This is the 6th time in a row that hiding something and not coming forward of our own volition has bit us. The biggest complaint about us is not anything we're doing, but what we're hiding. They still, even now, sitting here right now, have not made a pivot towards transparency. It's still leak, drip, 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 and it's somebody else with a wrench loosening that faucet to make it drip in the first place. It's not them. They're not even the cause of the drip. It's third-party sources. It's Chad Livengood. It's MERS.com. Charlie LaDuff. Not them. So, and a botching of this degree on something that's so simple, so easy, so basic to get right, it honestly ought to shake the confidence of any fair-minded person assessing this administration. Because this wasn't that hard. This was easy to get right in the first place. It was very easy to correct once it went off course. It was even easier than that once it ran into the wall. Take the hit. It's a bad 3 to 5 day news cycle because you blew it up, upstream. Then move on. They still, even now, have not figured it out. And if you couldn't figure this out, this is a 2-piece puzzle. This ain't hard. If you can't figure this out, how am I supposed to feel about your ability to run anything? I was a Whitmer voter. I'm wondering what I was thinking. What am I supposed to do? This couldn't have been more easy to get right, and they didn't. So look, that's that. I don't know how anyone objective. I have liberals in my social circle, quite a few, actually. It's almost 50-50. I don't know even any of these people that are defending this stuff. It's objectively poorly handled. So that's the most you're going to hear from me tonight. Because I'm going to have a sip of water and hand it over to the guy that's 100 times smarter, 100 times better at this stuff, certainly. But it's shocking for me. I'm curious what he thinks. He's Chad Livengood. He's senior editor for Crain's Detroit Business. I promised him I was going to get my rant out of the way, and then Ford's going to be his. Welcome, Chad, back to your 3rd appearance, I believe, on the Spiro Avenue Show.
That's correct. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. Look, you've been all over this, like always. You've been awesome. You and a few others. We mentioned a couple of them. Look, at the end of the day, what I admire about you is you are the ultimate fair guy. And we talked about it the last time you were in. I have no idea if you're a liberal, a conservative, if I'm just reading you. I mean, I don't even know if you're friends. No. You're fair. That's sort of your thing. So, I mean, you tell me, you've covered the story. You know what's going on better than anybody, probably. What do you make of this? I mean, am I way off base? Because we can debate the ethics later. But in terms of the crisis management strategy and the communication, has this not been a total calamity at this point?
I mean, the plane has left the runway on this one, for lack of a better analogy. And it is harder to think of a worse way it could have been handled, from the start and throughout the process of it. I mean, I've never seen. So let's just back up a little bit. The $27,000 cost that initially they said was not a gift and everything was done within the law, was paid for by this nonprofit, which is governors and politicians of all stripes get to set up these little nonprofit organizations that can take money from donors unlimited amounts, and there's very little transparency. It's separate from the Campaign Finance Act. It's not part of your leadership pack. It's not part of your campaign committee. It is a separate little fund, and for all intents and purposes, it is a slush fund. I mean, in Lansing parlance, that is how people treat it. It is been documented over the years. Legislators use these things to buy tickets to U of M football games, rent vehicles for travel, reimburse themselves, pay for extra things that come up that maybe their office budget doesn't pay for. And so governors have done this in recent history. Rick Snyder had what was called the Nerd Fund, very infamous, and it was, what was that stand for? New Energy Reinventing, I don't know, something. It was nerdy. It was Snyder, but initially they were using it for some consultants, some additional travel, and then they sort of infamously used it to pay for his top aide, Rich Baird's salary. They were paying him $130,000 a year as a private contractor. Really rare, weird thing. I wrote extensively about that when I was at the Detroit News, and it became the subject of some lawsuits, and I had to camp out in Mason, Michigan for like several Wednesdays in a row to basically track this lawsuit that was going on over the Nerd Fund. I say this because the previous governor went through a whole lot of like his own crisis with one of these slush funds, and so then this governor comes along, and they say after weeks of sort of obfuscation, they say, "Hey, we paid for it through this fund, this $27,000, and it's all good. It's legal." The governor's chief of staff, as you quoted her directly, said this was done within the law, and within a week or two, they changed how they were going to pay for it because a Republican group came out and filed a complaint with the IRS saying you can't use social welfare nonprofits to pay for your own personal travel on a luxury charter jet to and from Florida. Never mind all the circumstances. Just put aside for a second the circumstances. The governor has faced extreme death threats. There was a very sophisticated plot to kill her and kidnap and kill her by what we can only just describe as men who would be described as domestic terrorists. Put that aside for 1 second and just look at the circumstances. There is a state plane. She can ride the state plane to Florida. They can take her to Florida. They've taken her to D.C. They've taken governors all the time
for personal use.
In some capacities, yes. If it was necessary for her safety, there's a good argument to be made that would be useful. I mean, we don't know all the exact details of her father, Dick Whitmer's medical conditions, but he's said to be in failing health. So there could have been some consideration to that. You can also actually just hire a regular old charter. You don't have to call up a businessman in Detroit and say, "Hey, can I use your plane?" Which is what happened here. Okay, that's what's kind of gotten lost is Joanne Holes or someone close to Joanne called Jim Nicholson, the chairman of PVS Chemicals, and said, "Can we use your plane?" Now they haven't even. This is one of the things that they've obfuscated about. They haven't even really said who actually said this. Joanne kind of said she arranged it in her memo, but then they came out with like weird, different, varying statements between a spokesman for the campaign committee for the governor and an attorney for the campaign committee who was also an attorney for the slush fund, and who had competing statements about who actually made the call. They haven't even coughed up that piece of information yet. But here's my working theory. Joanne Holes used to be chief of staff to the chemical bank chairman, Gary Torgo. Gary Torgo is a very, very influential, connected businessman. It is not a stretch that Gary Torgo might have been involved here in some fashion. where he might have made a call to Jim Nicholson, who then connected his son, David Nicholson, the president of the company, with Joanne Holes. They made a deal. They arranged this thing. I mean, this contact was made on a Monday, and Governor Whitmer was getting picked up at the Lansing Capitol Airport on a Friday. And so it was a pretty quickly put together trip.
Oh, before you go to another tab, please like, subscribe, and follow for more clips and highlights. Good? Okay.
See, beautiful. That's a natural at work.